talk about the control of hormones. Control of hormones lies at the level of receptors, which we're going to be considering the downstream receiving ability, or at the level of endocrine glands, which we're going to be considering the upstream signal. So the basic idea, so we're going to be discussing the glands first. The idea of upstream and downstream is a rather sophisticated scientific concept that we use in neurobiology a lot because it talks about how thinking about that presynaptic and postsynaptic cell, you're thinking about an upstream cell would be the presynaptic cell, or the cell that is releasing the stuff, or the cell that is talking. When you're looking at a downstream reception of signal, you're talking about the listening cell, the postsynaptic cell, the cell that's receiving the input. So the same exact thing happens with hormones. It's a little bit more, of course, it's going through the bloodstream, and we're going to be talking about receptors and things like that. But the basic idea is still the same. You have one particular tissue or set of cells that is talking, that is releasing the hormones, and those would be your glands typically. And we'll talk about a few exceptions to that, but we typically think of endocrine glands as being the upstream signalers, the releasers of hormones, the manufacturers usually of the hormones. They are the talkers. They're the ones sending the signal in the first place. And then just keep in mind down the line, we're going to be talking about target cells that receive the input as well. And that would be considered the downstream signal. So it's pretty important to separate out those two concepts in your mind before we even really start the conversation about the endocrine system. Okay, so again, we say that hormone release is the upstream signal. Some control over hormones is at the level of the endocrine glands. And here they are. Here's our endocrine glands. This right here, this pituitary gland, is considered to be the master endocrine gland, although it's not technically a master. It's actually completely mastered by a portion of the brain that is called the hypothalamus that lies in the diencephalon of the brain right up here. We'll be talking more about that communication. But the basic idea is that all of these glands, there's the thymus, there's the thyroid, parathyroids, we're going to be going over all these, adrenals, pancreas, ovaries, testes, the pineal gland is considered one. I think that about does it for the main endocrine glands. So these are the upstream signals, the releasers of hormones, usually the manufacturer of hormones. So when we talk about glands, it's important to understand how it is that they decide to release their hormone content. And so this is what we call endocrine gland stimuli. The stimulation of the endocrine glands themselves. They have to decide at some point to release these hormones. And how does that happen? Well, it happens three different ways. The first of the ways is called the humoral stimulus or the humoral stimulus. The idea of the humoral stimulus is that you have changing nutrient levels in the blood that signal to that particular endocrine gland, hey, we have too much of such and such, or we have not enough of such and such, so you need to be activated so that we can get more of this thing or less of this thing. So the typical example that we use for this would be blood calcium, and blood glucose is also a really good example of this. So if we have low blood calcium, there will be a signal that goes out to these guys right here, which are called the parathyroid glands. They release this hormone called PTH, parathyroid hormone. And then the calcium levels are regulated upwards. They're upregulated, and it has a few different ways that it works to ensure that more calcium enters into the blood. So if the signal was low calcium levels in the blood, that signal would go to the parathyroid glands. They would release their hormone, which is, they only have one product, which is PTH, parathyroid hormone, and that in turn causes the upregulation of calcium. So more calcium being put into the blood. So it's a really good, clean example of a humoral stimulus. So the term humoral comes from the idea that the body's humors are the fluids inside of the body, and that it's kind of an old-fashioned term, but it still carries forward as far as blood is concerned. We still refer to the blood in our body as a humor, sometimes. All right, next we have a neural stimulus. The idea of a neural stimulus is that in some cases, nerve signals can actually cause a hormone release. The only example that we really have of this is adrenaline and noradrenaline that are released from this guy right here. This is in the medulla of the adrenal gland. That's why it's called adrenaline. This little structure right in here releases a great deal of noradrenaline and adrenaline, which, by the way, are also called norepinephrine and epinephrine. And the reason they ever release these things is that they are signaled to do so. So this is the sympathetic fibers coming through the autonomic nervous system, coming from the spinal cord here. And so this is actually the only example we have of a hormone released by a nervous signal specifically. So those hormones, adrenaline and noradrenaline, will be released into the bloodstream like any other hormone. And there it is. So that is a neural stimulus. This is the only example of it. The third type of endocrine gland stimulus is called a hormonal stimulus. And we'll be spending some time talking about this. It's a biggie. It's a major way that the endocrine system is regulated and controlled. So the idea of hormonal stimulus is that the presence of certain hormones can cause the release of others. Generally speaking, these hormones are going to be called tropic hormones. There's the spelling right there. It's spelled just like tropic. However, we call it tropic. That's the pronunciation that we use. The word tropic means maintaining. And so just following one example of this, the anterior pituitary gland releases a hormone that is called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. That is a hormone that when it interacts, so it's released into the blood like any other hormone, and then when it interacts with the thyroid gland, which is its target, the TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, will cause the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. So it's the presence of these hormones here, the thyroid stimulating hormone, that in turn causes the release of thyroid hormone. We'll be looking